Okay, let's start our roundtable. Hello, everybody. We are all in many different time zones, so I want to thank everyone for coming today. And particularly, I want to begin by thanking our presenters for being with us today to discuss the very important issue of genocidal threats to LGBTQ plus life across the globe. I am Elisa von Jurdenforge. I'm the co-president of the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention, along with my colleague Irene Victoria Massimino. And we at the Lemkin Institute are very honored that you have all taken your time to discuss this important issue with us. And as we've mentioned, we hope that this will be the start of a range of global dialogues on the intersection of genocide prevention and LGBTQ plus rights initiatives aimed at creating a more secure and dignified life for all human beings around the world. And we are looking very forward to learning from each of you today. I wish also to thank very deeply our Lemkin Institute interns for the hard work they have done in preparing this event. And specifically in this respect, I wish to thank Gretchen Moore, who has communicated with all of you and has been critical to getting this initiative off the ground. And she will be asking questions of our presenters today. I also want to thank Melissa Arnault, another of our interns, for designing all of our event materials, and Lexi Poston, who will be introducing each of our guests. And finally, I want to thank everyone who has joined us in the audience today from around the world. We're very grateful that you are a part of this initiative. We're going to start this roundtable with presentations from each of our presenters, after which we will ask a few questions of them. And then we will open up questions to everybody else, to our audience. And so those of you in the audience, please write your questions in the chat, and we will ask them for you when that point arrives. Or if you would like to jump in, you can ask to be unmuted. We have muted everyone for security purposes, but you can ask to be unmuted, and we will unmute you if you want to make a comment or if you want to ask your question verbally. Before we begin, I would like to make a few introductory comments to kind of frame how the Lemkin Institute views this work. So we're meeting today, as many of you probably know, a day after the US Supreme Court overturned the groundbreaking abortion rights decision from 1973, Roe versus Wade. This decision, yesterday's decision from the Supreme Court, has exposed the weaknesses of women's rights in the United States, and indeed the depth of work that still needs to be done worldwide for women to be recognized as full human beings with bodily autonomy and personal sovereignty. But I think yesterday's Supreme Court decision goes much further than that. I think yesterday's Supreme Court decision demonstrates the importance of intersectionality in our work, since the legal basis for overturning Roe versus Wade will be used in the coming years to challenge other legal decisions in the United States that rely on the right to privacy, such as the right to access contraception and the right of same-sex couples to marry. And finally, even beyond that, the logic of this decision, which deprives people who can get pregnant, which is both men and women, of the right to control their own bodies, is in line with attacks on the rights of transgender people in the United States, where multiple laws and bills have been introduced in multiple states that would in fact make being transgender illegal and would make the expression of transgender identity, such as through access to appropriate healthcare, punishable by long prison terms, among other things. When we look at violence against LGBTQ plus people, whether that violence is implicit, as in policy and law, or direct, as in hate crimes, I think we can see the existence and emergence of totalitarian practices across the globe. Modern homophobia, transphobia, and anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment developed alongside the very settler colonialism, imperialism, totalitarianism, and genocide that have forged our modern world. Indeed, the failure of democracies to recognize the core importance of respect for bodily autonomy in a truly democratic social order has rendered them quite vulnerable to fascism since the start. Built into these systems are the structures of their own dissolution. And therefore, when we recognize anti-LGBTQ plus violence as a harbinger of genocidal violence, we are recognizing the way in which modern societies develop and practice techniques of control and destruction against certain populations before they move on to others. Beyond that, the types of practices that are expressed in anti-LGBTQ plus laws, policies, and forms of direct violence are often microcosms of genocidal violence. And here I've been very influenced by the work of Haley Marie Brown, who will be speaking today, which in and of themselves suggest genocidal intent among the responsible parties, calling attention to the myriad ways in which genocide can occur in plain view in so-called peacetime without it being properly named or addressed. When existence or expression of identity is denied or punished, we are in the space of a form of reproductive violence that seeks to undermine permanently the ability of a group to continue into the future. Now, the Lemkin Institute has put this concern at the core of what we do, and we have taken an approach to genocide and its prevention that places reproductive violence, which we understand both biologically, but mostly culturally and symbolically, the reproduction of identities. We put that at the center of our work. We view denial of bodily autonomy and denial of identity as two of the most important red flags of emerging and existing genocidal ideology in a state, a party, or an armed group. We encourage people who are interested in this work, in any fashion of this work, we encourage you to join us by reaching out to us, by volunteering, by subscribing to our website, and by following us on social media. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this roundtable over to presenters, and particularly over to Lexi Poston, who will be introducing our presenters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Forgy. We are so happy to have everyone here today to listen to these absolutely fantastic speakers. And so we're going to kick the event off with Farida Mostafa speaking. Farida manages and coordinates Protection Approaches Queering Atrocity Prevention Program, which looks at LGBTQI+ groups' unique risks and vulnerabilities to mass atrocities, and the ways in which pragmatic interventions and risk frameworks can respond to them efficiently and swiftly. Farida was born and raised in Egypt and has previously worked with Doria Feminist Fund on supporting women's rights and LGBTQI right groups within the Middle East and North Africa region. She holds a BA in anthropology from the American University in Cairo and a master's in human rights from University College in London. So Farida, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Alexis, for this introduction, and thank you so much for having me today. I thought it might be nice to start with a little bit of introductions about Protection Approaches and the work that we do. So Protection Approaches is a UK-based charity. We work to tackle identity-based violence and to change how the world views it, and hopefully in doing so, be able to prevent it. My line of work specifically under that falls under queering atrocity prevention, which specifically focuses on how we can center LGBTQI+ risks, vulnerabilities, but also expertise when it comes to atrocity prevention. We recently published a paper that actually drew on the expertise of a lot of people who are in the room today, so I'm so glad that we're able to have this discussion together. And I'm also really glad that we are having a panel on discussing threats, because it's no secret, the world's on fire. There is a lot going on, and sometimes we can be consumed by a lot of firefighting to deal with what is already happening. But I think that we have the chance to discuss threats and things that might develop down the line before they do is a really valuable opportunity. And I'm really glad that we're able to have this discussion. So what I would really love to talk to you about today is perhaps starting with an overview of manifestations of violence against LGBTQI plus people globally. And this is by no means an exhaustive list or a comprehensive list. It's just shining perhaps a light on different current issues that are happening at the moment. And then also how and why could these phenomena inform genocidal threats to LGBTQI plus life? And so as not to end on a super grim note, I would want, collectively discussing and thinking of what we can do from our own positions in the face of these emerging threats. So to start off, I think it's important to note that existing prejudices, discrimination, homophobia, and transphobia around the world, as well as different political processes, like democratic backsliding or authoritarianism, they both really interact and intersect to inform genocidal threats to LGBTQI plus populations. If we start with an example that has been unfortunately forced into the agendas of some of us that work in foreign policy and atrocity prevention, that would be Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We can hear reports of, for example, trans individuals finding it quite difficult to traverse borders because of differences in how they present and what their IDs might look like. If we look at Russia's behavior more broadly, we can also see that moralistic anti-LGBTQI plus legislation has been really a key feature of Putin's rule over the last decade. If we look at the 2013 gay propaganda law that under the guise of protecting children and traditional family values has banned any kind of positive messaging about LGBTQI plus rights. If we also look at what's happening in Chechnya and the gay purges that have included police intentionally targeting gay men, rounding them up, and in many cases actually forcibly disappearing people and engaging in horrific forms of abuse and torture. I think these are examples of current issues that are really impacting LGBTQI plus life globally. Another current and also very unfortunate example comes from Afghanistan. We're not pretending that Afghanistan was ever a safe place for queer populations. But there are reports that since the US withdrawal and since the Taliban takeover, that we are seeing an increase in violence against queer populations in the forms of extrajudicial executions and violence and abuse. And another example that's maybe hits a bit home for me, because it's where I'm from, is Egypt, which is also we see a very clear, systematic, intentional approach to persecuting queer populations, where police officers will actually pose as potential dates and partners on dating apps and lure. It mainly targets gay men into meeting them and unfortunately arresting them and using that as grounds for criminal prosecution. And I think it's really important to note that these risks are not exclusive or unique to the global South. If we look at our own context where we're operating at the moment in the global North, I'll start with the UK, which is where I'm based right now. We have a really unfortunate and quite violent debate that is refusing to include trans communities in bans on conversion therapy, for example, which does not really paint a very healthy or positive image of how the UK is approaching trans rights. If we look at the US, they don't say gay bills in Florida, again, under the guise of protecting children, to ban any kind of positive messaging. And of course, the devastating news that we've heard yesterday of overturning the constitutional right of women's access to abortion. Like, these are things that are not completely separate from genocidal threats, because if we look at histories, we know that such social fractures and moralistic approaches to governance have often preceded genocidal violence and mass atrocities more broadly. I mean, even if we look at the paradigmatic case of genocide, the Holocaust, we can see that one of the first things that Hitler did when he became chancellor in 1933 was to begin a systematic campaign to eradicate Germany's LGBT population, to gain support for their populist project, but also to produce a sort of pure ruling population. Another example is that Nazi demonstrators at the time also raided and burned down the Institute for Sexology, which housed one of the first LGBTQI plus rights in the world, LGBTQI plus organizations in the world. So I think it's really important at this point to note that the intentional and systematic targeting of queer populations based on their identity is not separate from the processes that inform genocidal threats, I would say for two main reasons. Because A, it legitimizes identity as a base for exclusion. And also B, it creates really, I think, a sense of fear in communities that inhibits a sort of cultural reproduction where people are able to explore what it means for them to belong to the queer community in their own contexts and to build ties with fellow members of the community. It just becomes difficult to exist. So these dynamics are captured to an extent in the atrocity prevention sector and in policy frameworks. For example, if we look at the UN Framework of Analysis for Atrocity Crimes, which sets out common risk indicators for the incidence of mass atrocities, we see things like intergroup tensions or patterns of discrimination, or signs of an intent to destroy a protected group. But we don't really know what that looks like specifically for queer populations. How does this manifest specifically for queer populations? So as promised, so as not to end on a super grim note, really, what can we do better in the face of these emerging threats? What can we do better as academics, as practitioners, as policymakers that are working either in the atrocity prevention sector, in the wider peace and security sector, or even the wider human rights sector? I think it's really important to start that we really need to engage with the specific and unique risks, vulnerabilities, and expertise of queer populations globally. Because as I hope we discussed, that some of these instances do already fit the threshold for some atrocity crimes, while some of them really sound the alarm that we're heading in a very scary direction. So in both cases, it's really important that we're able to engage with these threats and to make sure that they're captured in risk analysis frameworks and early warning mechanisms, and also in humanitarian responses. And this could be a bit abstract, but thinking of more concrete things that we might be able to do is, if we look at the existing, for example, risk analysis frameworks, we can engage in a sort of co-development of these frameworks with queer populations to ensure that their perceptions of what could trigger genocidal threats are captured within these frameworks. Perhaps we need LGBTQI plus specific risk frameworks to capture these risks very specifically. And some of the work that we've been doing at Protection Approaches has been around that, where we're working to develop risk indicators for LGBTQI plus vulnerability to mass atrocities in consultation with queer populations, specifically from Sudan and Afghanistan. So I think we hope that the next steps for this effort would enable us to kind of monitor and tailor responses to mass atrocities. And I think another, something that I think I've also seen, particularly having worked in fundraising previously in Egypt, is that there is a new trend to be from human rights donors and peace and security donors to be locally led, which is a very welcome change for sure. But I think as donors are engaging more and more with global issues, they need to also make sure that they're not enforcing local biases that might exist. And one way to do that is to engage with local civil society organizations. What are they doing? What are they saying? What are their concerns and priorities? I think that would be a very good place to start. And finally, last but certainly not least, we need to really engage with risk factors for mass atrocity in our own context, because no society is immune to mass violence. We need to start by understanding that pre-existing conditions exist to different degrees in all societies. So what can we do in our own contexts that would, hopefully reduce risks to queer populations? So I hope I haven't taken too much of your time, but to wrap up, a lot of this is extrapolated on in our Queering Atrocity Prevention paper. And some of our next steps is that we want to work with our sector to make sure that a lot of these recommendations we are able to see them come to life in our sector, and to work with partners to ensure that this does indeed happen. And we're also going to be working on a global community consultation that we really hope will inform the development of risk indicators for LGBT vulnerability to mass atrocity. I'll stop there, but I'm really excited to see what others have to say about this important topic. And if anyone has any questions or is interested in the work that we do, please feel free to drop me an email. I'll be more than happy to have a longer chat about this. Over to Alexis, I believe.
Thank you, Farida. Now we're going to move over to Haley Marie Brown. Haley Marie is a transgender woman, genocide scholar, educator, and she is also author of the groundbreaking work, Gendercide in the 21st Century and the Destruction of the Transgender Body, where she examines the genocidal nature of the ritualistic violence present within the murders of transgender women. She is a graduate of Stockton University, where she graduated in 2020 with her master's in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. So Haley, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, everybody. Before I get started, just want to thank the hosts and all the rest of the participants and panelists for having me and hearing me speak. It's an honor getting to share my work once again with very important individuals, and as we have this very important conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and just share kind of a brief presentation. Let me get that going. I got a screen share first, sorry. Okay, screen. Okay. All right, so this is sort of something that I'm referring to as literally being on the edge of violence. And I was focusing specifically on this issue of rhetoric, right? And specifically rhetoric within the contemporary campaign to eradicate trans identity. My context is focusing specifically on the West, more so on the United States than Europe in that regard. But I'll just go ahead and jump right into it. This isn't a complete history of everything, but I think this is a kind of a nice summation of the recent events that have sort of led us to this moment. So in the mid-2010s, when Theresa May was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, she proposed some reforms to what is now known as the Gender Recognition Act back in 2016. And this sort of set off a firestorm in the United Kingdom of trans-exclusionary radical feminists, what we refer to as TERFs, who sort of campaign alongside this conservative British media that has sort of captured this issue in the United Kingdom. And this campaign is sort of ceaseless. Regular newspaper campaigns, regular protests, all sort of around this idea that transgender women somehow pose a systemic threat to the physical safety and social equality of women and girls. Right? Across the pond in the United States, we sort of see this trend start to begin in 2016 also as well, when North Carolina passes House Bill 2, which we may remember as the bathroom bill, which also set off a firestorm of backlash. And for a minute, it was sort of assumed that the United States sort of would push back against the transphobia, whereas the UK sort of culturally embraced it. But as we've seen, that isn't actually the case. This passage of this bill sort of became a catalyst for the slate of anti-trans movements and laws in the United States, of which we are now seeing today. So some characteristics of this anti-trans movement, both on the trans-exclusionary radical feminist side and on the conservative sort of far-right reactionary side, a lot of them have similar positions. There is some differentiation, of course, but a lot of the positions are very similar. So again, they're sort of hyper-focused on this erroneous idea that transgender ideology, which is, again, a term that I think has no meaning, poses a threat to cisgender women and girls, right? And this sort of also continues on in this claim that parents of transgender children are abusers by definition and should have their children removed by the state. There's also some states, such as Texas, which want those parents to be imprisoned, in addition to having their children taken away. Some believe transgender people should be outright killed or lynched. I have more on that later. Some believe that trans-inclusive language and trans-inclusive legislation is erasing women. They repeatedly argue vociferously that trans women are deceivers who seek to violate the sanctity of women's spaces in order to harm women and girls. And this is things like bathrooms, locker rooms, even something as simple as sports as a concept, right? So now it's not even about physical spaces, it's about the conceptual spaces as well. And also, we're now moving into this territory that transgender identity in younger adults and children is a social contagion. I'll have more on that one later. Biology equals destiny. Again, we're sort of returning back to this one. Two genders, you're either a man or a woman, XXXY, the sort of essentialism that has been really consistent in the backlash against LGBTQ equality as a whole, not just in this contemporary issue. Trans people, as we sort of saw earlier this morning, and by extension, LGBTQ people as a whole, are somehow grooming or sexualizing children by their mere existence. Transgender identity is harmful because it sterilizes children, which prevents them from having children in the future. And that many see trans identity as a dangerous and corrupting force, and that it destroys families and the lives and bodies of children and young adults, particularly young women and lesbians. I mean, this point is very prominent in recent campaigns. And in fact, in Texas, there was a husband who was running for, rather an ex-husband of somebody who was running for office to try to pass a law to get their kid back because a court ruled that they shouldn't have custody of their children because they wanted to prevent them from receiving gender affirming care, excuse me. So it's gotten to the point where sort of personal vendettas have now become the reason campaigns are being launched in many red states. Just some examples here of where this is going. So we see in The Economist, a major newspaper, magazine rather, excuse me, a system of gender self-identification would put women at risk. Anti-transgender activist quotes by the BBC calls for trans women to be lynched. This was in response to this article that the BBC put out about how trans women are pressuring lesbians into having sex with them. And they quoted this woman, and it turned out that this woman is not only a serial sexual predator herself, she has openly written numerous times for trans women to be lynched and executed by the state or just by people, right? Now we're moving into ID cards. Trans people need to carry special ID cards. This is a British newspaper, The Telegraph. And we need trans people need to carry ID cards to keep women safe, right? And then here, this is a video. I hope everybody can hear it. This was at a Back the Blue protest in Pittsburgh a couple years ago, and it somehow turned into this. Okay, I don't know if anybody could hear that. I hope you could, but the man with the megaphone at a Back the Blue protest, which is a pro-police protest, started shouting, kill transgenders, repeatedly for seemingly no reason. So this seems to be on the mind of these people, even when it doesn't necessarily apply. So if we move forward to the rhetoric, right, it's really important that we examine the specific language that's used by anti-trans campaigners. As many of us know from other examples of genocide, rhetoric is a powerful tool in creating conditions for violence, right? Here we see words such as groomer and rapist and pedophile. These are not new. They have existed for a very long time. When gay rights movements were kicking off in the United States and in the Western Europe, this was a very common refrain. You know, gay men are, want to molest children, and lesbians are predators who prey on young girls. It's not new, right? What is new, however, is this hyperfixation on biology, and specifically the way that biology is being weaponized as a means of creating the conditions necessary for violence, right? So I'm not referring again to this argument that I made earlier that chromosomal sex is destiny, but rather how the implications of this specific rhetoric that has a biological connotation. So specifically, I'm looking at biologically charged words like contagion, as in social contagion, parasite, and epidemic, right? So these words are deliberate and they're used to frame this debate, put that in quotes there, and in very specific and consequential ways. Each one of these words carries a very specific connotation that is related to disease, sickness, or something which needs to be treated or fixed, right? And in this case, we're sort of seeing this group of people who are positioning trans identity, and by extension, trans people themselves, as undermining the very biological foundations of cisgender identity and cisnormativity. In other words, proponents of this ideology believe fundamentally at their core, whether it's implicit or explicit, that allowing this epidemic or parasite or contagion of transgender ideology to continue presents an existential and ontological threat for the continuation of cisgender people and by extension, the human species. Hence this hyperfixation on this issue of so-called sterilization, right? How can you're ruining the future for these kids to have children, and you're ruining the future for Americans if you sterilize these kids, right? Putting aside the fact that there are obviously multiple means of reproduction, this is the fundamental core of what they're getting at. So just some examples again. This is the author of that book that you saw on the right-hand screen of the screen when I shared the previous slide. This is Abigail Schreier. She is what we would call a trans-exclusionary radical feminist and a very conservative writer. And she calls trans people an epidemic and trans identity an epidemic that is affecting young girls and women, particularly young lesbians, right? And then this is Julie Bindel. Julie Bindel gave a speech in Parliament in which she called trans women parasites for occupying the bodies of the oppressed. So bringing this all together, we see the intersection of rhetoric and genocide and its implications for trans identity. So as I mentioned previously, we sort of see how rhetoric is a powerful tool for creating the conditions for genocide. This is very apparent in the Holocaust, in Rwanda, Bosnia, and elsewhere. And the core component of this rhetoric is sort of framing these actions of discrimination and harassment, and in some cases mass murder, as justifiable because this target group, in this case trans people, supposedly represents this existential threat to the state, nation, or people. In Nazi Germany, this was the Jews and others, particularly the Jews and the communists. In Rwanda, it's the Tutsi. In Serbia, it's the Bosniaks and Bosnian Croats who posed the biggest barrier to Slobodan Milosevic's greater Serbia. Right. And then if we're looking here, genocide, like the genocides mentioned above, it's abundantly clear that the purpose of this rhetoric against trans people is stochastic. Fundamentally, it's about creating the social conditions necessary where society views it as prima facie necessary to discriminate against transgender people and eliminate transgender identity out of concern for security. And this is not just security of the state, of the nation. We're now sort of seeing people turn the gendered rhetoric of genocide and the gendered conceptions of genocide and genocidal violence, right, on its head. Previously, Dr. Forgy and a few others have sort of written about how genocidal violence warps gender and warps issues, warps concepts like the family and turns family relationships and gender sort of on their head to serve some sort of communicative purpose, right? And in this case, we're not seeing genocide as a way of turning gender on its head, but rather regulating gender to the point of enforcing traditionalism in a way that goes beyond sort of what we saw in Nazi Germany, right? Because ironically, there are several instances in Nazi Germany where the Nazis themselves, either through bureaucratic nightmares or one reason or another, where trans people were actually given paperwork that matched their gender identity and allowed to exist within the confines of Nazi Germany into the late 1930s and 1940s. So while Germany is at war, you would think that they would naturally be on top of this against homosexuals and imprisoning them, but there are several instances where trans people were allowed to exist. this campaign doesn't even want to allow for that loophole to even continue, right? So it's telling to me that the contemporary anti-trans campaign is somehow more anti-trans than Nazi Germany, which on some level should scare people. And I want to focus specifically, again, to continue on this trend of comparing this to Nazi rhetoric, right? This is Jennifer Bielek. Jennifer Bielek just recently wrote an article that I would hope that many of you are familiar with in the Jewish magazine called Tablet Mag. Not only was it explicitly anti-Semitic, it sort of posited the idea that transgender ideology is being funded by rich, wealthy Jewish men who have a vested interest in controlling populations. Starting to sound pretty familiar here. Jennifer Bielek is also an alumnus of a eco-terrorist and eco-fascist organization that also has radical feminist leanings called Deep Green Resistance. And we see here she calls transgenderism a global cult. Transgenderism is promoting humanism. We have Andrew Sullivan here, who's calling this issue the trans question, right? What are we going to do with the trans? What are we going to do with the Jews? It's the same principle. When you start referring to people as a question to be solved, rather than as a group of people with specific needs and desires for equity and rights, you've automatically given in to the reactionaries who see these people, in this case, trans people, as needing to be eliminated. You've already ceded that ground to them by simply posing this issue as if it's a question of dire importance that needs to be solved, right? Just to kind of close things out here, I know the last speaker, Farida, had some positive news. I unfortunately am not so optimistic, particularly in the United States. As we've already seen, we see this vociferously anti-trans legislation that has already passed in several states, are already eliminating access to hormones and puberty blockers, as well as removing the ability to change identity documents. In Arkansas and Florida, I believe they're already working on a campaign to remove the access for hormones for adults. So previously it was about, we just can't let kids take them. Now they want to ban transition entirely by removing access to these care for this purpose, right? There are already campaigns to make being LGBTQ crime again. And SCOTUS, I think is going to overturn Griswold. I mean, we already saw that in the decision recently in the Roe case yesterday, when Justice Thomas issued his own concurrent opinion with the majority, in which he said the Supreme Court should revisit the precedents established in Griswold and others, including Lawrence v. Texas, and the case which also handled interracial marriage, right? So he even wants to revisit that precedent. The whole point of this is to abolish the right of privacy and allow for the state to legally and socially eliminate transgender identity and trans healthcare. Because once you remove those capabilities, once you remove the right to privacy, the digital surveillance state that we kind of see ourselves in today, that previous iterations of the civil rights movement, particularly for LGBTQ individuals, didn't have, right? We carry a security camera in our phones with us, right? So the state has unprecedented means of observing our behavior and observing our communications. And removing the right to privacy allows them to engage in this kind of surveillance. If we continue on here, we're looking at how violence against transgender people in this country will skyrocket. It is skyrocketing. We have Proud Boys protesting something as simple as drag queen story hour in the name of protecting children. It's only a matter of time before pro-trans events start becoming the target of their ire. In this case, we also see a campaign to define gender solely as birth sex. We've already seen states refuse the option to change identity documents, including birth certificates. So biology as destiny is not only a campaign, it is becoming law in several United States states. And this one hasn't happened yet, but I have a sneaking suspicion it will in the event of a Republican Congress and presidency. All identity document changes will be retroactively invalidated by Congress or executive order, and both institutions in the United States have the power to do this. And once that change is enacted, passports will by definition have to be seized because they'll be no longer valid. And in many states, we're starting to see conversion therapy being mandatory. This push to try to create identity out of a previous identity is not new. Conversion therapy has been a long-standing trend of the anti-LGBTQ reactionary movement. But in this case, I don't think I've ever seen it as close to becoming a full-blown law as I think it's going to be. And I'll just end with this. This is the direction that I think we're heading. The person on the left of your screen, that's Kelly Neidhart. Kelly Neidhart runs an organization in Texas called Protect Texas Kids. It's probably the most vociferously anti-trans organization, anti-gay organization, to put it more specifically, in the United States. And this was only a few days ago. She wants to round up people who participate in Pride events and put them in camps. This is the direction the American right is headed. And unless things dramatically change through mass organization, we are on the precipice of an unprecedented reactionary movement that has genocidal intentions for trans people and lesbian, gay, and bisexual and queer people as a whole here in the United States. So I'm going to end it there. If you have any questions, obviously, please feel free to ask them when we get to the Q&A portion. But with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn it over to Lexi. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Haley Marie. We're going to go to John Barac now. John is a human rights defender who's been active in civil society in Montenegro since early 2015 and was appointed as executive director of LGBT Forum Progress in September 2016. He's a member of several national bodies related to different aspects of human rights legislation, as well as the co-author of nearly a dozen LGBTQI plus focused publications. He is also an educator working with police officers, civil servants, youth, civil society representatives, political activists, and several others. So John, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Do I sound okay? Great. Well, thank you all for inviting me to speak today. Thank you to my co-presenters for sharing their insights. I mean, just listening to Haley Marie, it's deeply disturbing to hear what's been going on in the US. I lived and studied in the US for years ago, and back then we could see these things starting to take shape, and to know that it's as bad as it is right now, it's really distressing. And especially because, you know, we in Europe look at the United States as a leading example in these things. So it is quite distressing, and unfortunately it's only a matter of time before these things do kind of transfer in one way or another into our daily realities, and they already are, unfortunately. So what my focus here will be, and what my organization has been doing for over a decade, is hate, or specifically hate speech and hate crimes, and how these things actually are a prerequisite in a way to more serious atrocities and genocide in the end. So just to give you a bit of a context, so we started our work 12 years ago. And one of the first programs that we developed is this systematic and systemic monitoring of hate speech, particularly online and in the media, and reporting of hate speech, because we were able at one point to develop an okay mechanism to report these instances of hate speech and to have some sort of systemic response to them. But it remains a deeply rooted issue, and Montenegro is deeply polarized as a society. And I think this goes for the entire Western Balkans region, that we're deeply divided along, you know, identity lines of nationality, of religion, of ethnicity, and of you know, sexuality. And this topic is being widely misused to target LGBTI community and to target activists, and to be you know, one way of political promotion and political activism by pushing this broader anti-gender movement, which of course includes anti-LGBTI and anti-transgender narratives in it. So that's, and year after year, I think things are picking up and getting quite worse, because these movements are now much better funded, much better organized. They have much stronger international roots and systems of support. So that's now slowly transferring into our system. And it's very, very unsettling to be in this present moment and to just view this thing speeding up as we go along. And it's again, it's a big issue. And so part of this hate, and when I say hate, I refer primarily to hate speech, because that's the biggest part of our work, is coming from this, is coming from two places, I'll say. One of these places is organized hate. So, you know, everything I've said so far, everything we heard from previous presenters, that's one part of it. And that's roughly about half of it. And the other half is from this place of deep misunderstanding and extreme societal oppression, because in the Western Balkans here, I would say broadly, the majority population is oppressed by the political elites, and then also minority populations are oppressed by majority populations and by political elites. So it's oppression all around, and that leads also to the spread of hate, because when we have a chance to interact with these people who we report for spreading hate and for targeting us with hate, they usually say, you know, my life has been so bad. I remember this one specific case. My life has been so bad, and you know, I didn't have, you know, food for my family, and I saw this story about LGBTI, and I just vented out. So that's one side of it in our context, and unfortunately, it's also, you know, hate is very, very dangerous, and it is no matter what the cause of hate is, it poses real issues, because, for example, we have a couple of instances throughout the year where we have these major events or something happens, and then we see a rise of hate speech, and then immediately afterwards we see a rise of hate-based violence, and so, you know, attacks and threats and more abuse and domestic violence. So all of these things are a deep issue, and again, I speak for the context of Montenegro, but I also know that it's very similar in the Western Balkans region, and I think broader when we look at Europe. I know that we're looking at what's happening, for example, here in Hungary and in Poland, which are kind of prime examples of these extreme policies, pretty much copy pasting what the US far right has been doing and applying it in our European context. But I think there are also, at least to an extent, roadblocks in the shape and form of the European Union and the European institutions, which have more power, or at least should have more power, to prevent these things and respond to these things. You know, so at least to have some optimism here, I'll say that we are in a different situation, the whole of Europe, because we have these institutions that are more liberal and more democratic than we now see the United States Supreme Court to be. So again, at least some ray of hope. For Montenegro and for the Western Balkans, another specific thing also related to the European Union is this pre-accession or accession process and these pre-accession mechanisms of applying pressure onto candidate countries. So, you know, my country is in an authoritarian regime, and we've had the same government or the same party in power for more than 30 years now. Or if you want to look at it more broadly, we've had the same structure since 1945, since the Communist Party established itself as the only party. So it is an authoritarian system, and it is an absolutist system in that sense. And these systems do tend to oppress human rights more than any other. And these systems do tend to be more anti-LGBTI, anti-women, anti-gender, anti-everything, anti-minorities. But on the other hand, we have this external pressure of you know, having to align with the European values and principles and international law and all of these standards, which are pushing us in a different direction. I'm not going to say that Montenegrin society is per se anti-LGBTI, that it is hateful, that it is discriminatory, but it is those who are governing us in every sense of the way, politically and religiously and in all those different aspects. They're the ones who are anti-LGBTI. They're the ones who are pushing these narratives, and they're the ones who are you know, making our lives much more difficult than you know, in other countries. I know I was preparing for this roundtable. I was looking at the pyramid of hate as something that we always go back to, you know, the 5 levels. the genocide being on top. And it's always very disturbing to realize that we in Montenegro, in the Western Balkans, and I think globally, are living on level 4. Our realities is to be living surrounded by this bias-motivated violence, which is just one step away from genocide. And my understanding of this is it is a fine line, it is a thin line, it is also very dangerous line, but it can very easily be crossed. I mean, again, I go back to Hungary, I go back to Poland, what their regimes are doing and what their regimes are continuing to do is so very dangerously close to turning into something far more serious. I mean, it is serious now, of course, but turning into something far more evil. So we have to be mindful of that. And unfortunately, there is no simple solution to responding to any of this. There is no simple solution to rooting out hate, especially when it's being propagated by the political elites, by all the social elites, and those who lead us or should lead us forward. But I think doing things like these and doing small acts of activism and engaging locally with our communities, because if we make change within a small group, and that's at least what our practice and our work shows, that if we focus on a small group, on a family, on a small group of teachers, on a small group of activists somewhere, and we bring change to them and we make an impact there, that spreads also like a virus, but in a positive way. So I think, there is hope as long as we fight and push back. And definitely my heart goes to all my friends and fellow activists and colleagues in the United States and worldwide at this time, because, at any given second, there is a fight raging on somewhere where we have to be on the front lines. And unfortunately, I wish we had a world, or we had a place somewhere in the world where we don't have to fight. But I mean, what happened last night in Norway as well, the terror attack on the nightclub just before the Pride, it also shows that even in the most free and liberal and democratic and best rated countries in the world, there are those who intend to kill us and to destroy us actively. So again, also, I wish I had a more positive note for the end, but I'll just repeat the part that as long as we fight, then they can't really get us in the end. And I think as long as we stay strong, we have to prevail, because our fight is a just and a good one. So yeah, and I'll take your questions later, definitely.
Thank you, John. We're going to wrap up our panelists' presentations with Lily Nellans. She is currently pursuing a PhD in political science at the University of Toronto, and her research focuses on the heteronormative foundations of genocidal violence. So Lily, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Awesome. Well, of course, I want to thank everyone for taking some time out of their weekend to be here with us. And a huge thank you to the Lemkin Institute for organizing this roundtable and for all the work they're doing to jumpstart these important conversations. So today, I'm going to be talking about a relatively new research project I've been working on. And this project is looking at social and political right-wing movements in the US that are anti-queer and anti-trans, and the way that their domestic views on anti-trans and anti-queer politics impact their foreign policy objectives, especially when it comes to war, genocide, and atrocity crimes. So the cases that I'm looking at are Russia's invasion of Ukraine earlier this year and the Guatemalan Genocide of the 1980s. We'll start by talking about reactionary discourses of anti-trans and anti-queer violence in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I'm using the term reactionary here to cover a pretty wide swath of the kind of right wing of the US political spectrum. And this term, or at least the way I see it, encompasses all those from self-proclaimed moderate elected Republicans to the alt-right and very self-proclaimed proud white supremacist extremists. And amongst this reactionary group, there were two distinct responses to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The first was for them to be supportive of Russia for ideological and mainly religious reasons. And so the argument here is that the United States, and especially good Christian Americans, should be supporting Russia, and that Russia's crackdown on LGBTQ activists and rights and people, as well as the purges in Chechnya, are an example that the United States should be following. And they really view Russia, and especially Putin, as this vanguard of traditional white Christian family values. The second response comes from those who aren't necessarily supportive of Russia, and certainly not supportive of the invasion, but they blame the invasion on a weakened US. And as we'll learn, weak here is kind of a stand-in term that they use to refer to an increasingly queer, trans, and racially inclusive United States. And even though there are these two distinct responses, those who support Russia's invasion and those who are opposed to it, within this reactionary part of the political spectrum, they're unified by their support for anti-trans and anti-queer violence and policies, and they use the rhetoric and values that their supporters are familiar with from the anti-trans and anti-queer movements to support, justify, and explain their positions on Russia's invasion. This is one of the most prominent examples of the first type of response for those who see Russia as this protector of traditional white Christian sexualities and genders. This came from Tucker Carlson, who is probably the most prominent reactionary right-wing voice in the US media. Certainly the one with the show who has the most viewership. And in this clip from the day of the invasion, he's basically telling his viewers that they shouldn't fall for all these people telling them they should be mad at Putin and mad at Russia, because Russia's not the real threat to their values. It's kind of anti-racism and anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia work is what's really threatening them and their white supremacy and their Christian supremacy. And this clip was played over and over as propaganda on Russian state-owned television as well in the days following the invasion. This is another prominent example of this strand of response coming here from Steve Bannon, one of Donald Trump's most kind of noxious advisors. And ever since he's been pushed out of US party politics, he's been working on establishing a transnational group of politicians and activists dedicated to white supremacy, Christian supremacy activism, including across Europe, in the UK, in the Western Balkans, in Montenegro. And he's talking with Eric Prince, the former CEO of Blackwater, a private military contracting firm that committed multiple atrocities at the behest of the US government in Iraq. So transnational network of violence here. And they're saying, you know, they support Putin and they support Russia because they're anti-woke. And because not only do they, you know, not support trans and queer rights, there's not even an acceptance, the way they see it, of the existence of queer and trans identities. And I also just want to point out that they use the slur savage a couple of times, which I think subtly shows the way that settler colonialism, white supremacy, homophobia, transphobia all work together to support these discourses. This is another example coming from the American First Political Action Conference, where they were chanting and applauding for Putin just a couple days after the invasion. And AFPAC was founded because they saw the Conservative Political Action Conference and the Republican Party as too moderate. So those who don't support Russia also invoked this idea that the US has been weakened and distracted by a focus on issues of gender and sexuality, and that's why Ukraine was left vulnerable to invasion. But not all of this is coming from kind of these extreme voices that I featured, like Steve Bannon and Ben Shapiro. Scott Walker, for example, former governor of Wisconsin and Tea Party darling, speaking at CPAC, the supposedly too moderate conference, also invoked this idea of wokeness and weakness causing Russia's invasion. And in the most televised and in a certain sense, most legitimate Republican speech to the US public this year, the Republican State of the Union response, Governor of Iowa, Kim Reynolds, again, blames this focus on political correctness, which we all know is kind of a buzzword for blaming the progression of all sorts of human rights, as distracting the US from being militarily ready to challenge Russia. And there's a specific strand that blames trans inclusion in the military, especially for the reason that Ukraine was left vulnerable. So within the reactionary part of the US political spectrum, even those who are divided on this issue of foreign policy, those who are supportive of Russia, those who are opposed of Russia, they can all find common ground and communicate with one another and find solidarity in their anti-trans and anti-queer beliefs. And this is pretty obvious from the 238 bills, that number is probably higher now, honestly, that have been introduced at the state level in the US targeting queer and trans people, especially trans people. And a prime example of this was that Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds, the same politician who gave the Republican State of the Union, just a couple of weeks after that speech, a couple of weeks after the invasion, signed into law a bill banning trans women and girls from competing in K-12 and collegiate sports in Iowa, with this horrific photo, which again just highlights the complicity also of some parts of the women's movement in this as well. So as I watched all of this unfold in the past 6 months or so following the invasion, I was thinking to myself, have we seen this before, where the US right that's really passionate about these social issues translates that into their foreign policy? And one of the most prominent historical examples is the Christian right's response to the Guatemalan Genocide. So briefly, for those who might be less familiar with the Guatemalan Genocide, there was a 3 decades long civil war in Guatemala from 1960 to 1996, waged primarily by a number of insurgent groups made up of poor rural farmers and in rural indigenous Maya communities against the government. And the violence towards civilians was particularly harsh during the early to mid 1980s. And at the end of the Civil War, a UN Truth Commission documented all of these atrocities and found that due to the intensity of the violence and the fact that 4 out of 5 victims were indigenous Maya, a genocide had taken place during that period of intense violence in the 1980s. And during that period of intense violence, Guatemala was led by General Rios Montt, who was a darling of the United States Christian right. So Rios Montt takes control in a military coup in 1982 and launches a scorched earth campaign targeting rural Maya communities. So he argues that the insurgents are hiding in these communities, being supported by them, and that the only path forward is to completely destroy these rural communities and relocate the survivors to resettlement villages, which are essentially concentration camps overseen by the military. And Guatemala has a long history of oppressing Maya indigenous communities. So this is really an excuse to carry out a genocide that's been in the works. And the reason that Rios Montt becomes a darling of the US Christian right is because he is Guatemala's first born-again evangelical leader and one of only a few prominent Protestant politicians in the region then and today, as opposed to Catholic or secular leaders. And he's a member of an evangelical church in Guatemala called El Verbo. And El Verbo is associated and receives funds from an organization called Gospel Outreach in California, which is heavily involved in campaigning against queer and trans rights in the United States. Ronald Reagan develops a particular affection for Rios Montt, even though he supports these kind of violent dictators throughout Central America. He has a special liking for Rios Montt and a special interest in Guatemala. And this is because of how much Reagan is influenced by the Christian right. After meeting with Rios Montt at the encouragement of the Christian right, he says, he views him as a man of great personal integrity, This is a man the US government knows is committing genocide, has documented he is committing genocide, and told Reagan what they found, and he doesn't care, and instead, says Mont here is promoting social justice and that his administration will do all it can to support Mont. And the reason that Reagan becomes such a strong advocate for the Guatemalan military is because of this rhetorical move that the Christian right makes, linking the values of communism, which is how they're portraying the insurgents in Guatemala, to the values of the LGBT rights movement, and connecting both of those as a threat to the United States and family values in the US, which again is this code word for white supremacy, Christian supremacy. Both the insurgents in Guatemala and the gay rights movement in the US are often used, this term satanic is used to describe them, which again is just slapped on any movement that the Christian right disagrees with. And when I say the Christian right, I'm referring to a lot of groups you've probably heard of in the context of Anita Bryant and the Save Our Children campaign, pushing to make being gay a felony and ban gay teachers from schools. These are groups like Moral Majority, Focus on the Family, people like Jerry Falwell, and televangelist Pat Robertson. And they have tremendous influence on Reagan, and he really buys into this argument. And after meeting with people like Falwell and Robertson during the 1980 presidential election, he says all the complex questions facing it at home and abroad have their answer in the Bible. So here again, he is connecting the oppressive stance that he's taking domestically on these social issues with support for genocide and violent movements abroad. And the Christian right is heavily involved not only in politically lobbying for Guatemala, but also in getting their supporters and evangelical voters to support what's going on in Guatemala as well. Televangelist Pat Robertson, with his famous show, The 700 Club, is on air telling his viewers to pray for Rios Montt, to pray that Guatemala is successful. And this is while a genocide is taking place. But they're not only asking their supporters for prayers, they're asking them for money. Because before Ronald Reagan took office, the US had actually suspended military aid to Guatemala. And they launched a huge letter writing campaign, people like Falwell, Robertson, and Gospel Outreach do, to try to convince the United States to restore military aid to Guatemala. This convinces Reagan to ask Congress to take that step. Congress actually never does restore military aid to Guatemala. But Falwell, Robertson, Gospel Outreach, Moral Majority, and other organizations coordinate to raise money. And in 1983, they conduct what they call Operation International Love Lift, which sends 350 missionaries and $1 million worth of supplies to Guatemala in order to support the military. And most of this is actually given to those resettlement villages or concentration camps. And they also convinced some of their wealthiest supporters to buy military goods from private contractors, precursors to groups like Blackwater, to send to the Guatemalan military. And they convinced Reagan to back channel millions of dollars worth of weapons through allies like Israel to Guatemala as well. Of course, before, during, and after their actions supporting the Guatemalan genocide, the Christian right is also supporting campaigns against queer, gay, trans identities in the United States, against their rights, and against government support for those suffering from HIV/AIDS. Anita Bryant's one of the largest figures in this movement. Here you can see Jerry Falwell, a close personal friend and supporter of Rios Montt, headlining one of her events. And even as recently as 2016, Pat Robertson making horrific comments about the LGBTQ+ community. So just to conclude, couple of ways that I'm thinking about all of this is as evidence that the simultaneous deployment of anti-trans and anti-queer discourses in US foreign policy debates and domestic policy debates is likely to heighten their salience in both areas, increasing the visibility and danger of queer and trans communities in the United States, abroad, and all people in general who are at risk of mass political violence. begging us to ask the question, how can we build greater solidarity and coordination between those working on atrocity prevention and the movement for trans and queer lives, which is something we're doing here today. And also that genocide, transphobia, and homophobia are and have always been the product of transnational networks of activists. So progressive activists need to challenge their financial power and political influence on a similar level. And I think the good news of knowing that we share an opponent between those working in atrocity prevention and those working to protect trans and queer lives is that we can also share in the solutions and share and build solidarity in our activism as well. So I'll leave it there and turn it back, I think, to Gretchen for some questions.
Thanks, Lily. We are going to quickly turn it over to Dr. Forgy and Irena for some concluding remarks, and then we'll turn it over to Gretchen for questions.
Hi, I'm going to let Irena make a few concluding remarks about particularly the law, the role of the law, the role that the law plays in all of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elisa. Thank you, Haley, Farida, John, Lily. Your presentations were very informative, incredible. I have learned so much. I want to apologize for the people coming to express hate speech at the beginning of this. I will say, because I have to say it, it's still unbelievable. I'm in shock and I wasn't expecting it. But I apologize to all of our presenters and our audience who's here. Unfortunately, we couldn't let any more people in because we'll probably continue to experience this. It would be nice for these people who have no clue of what they're talking about to actually stay here and learn something. But unfortunately, their hate probably overcomes all of that, and all of they do is just that hate speech. So saying that, once again, thank you all for your presentations. I want to make just a couple of comments or remarks on each of one of your presentations. I also have a request from a colleague of mine in Argentina to translate something, but I'll let Gretchen tell me when I can do that, because she was also commenting on this, of these people coming in to express hate in different ways. So once again, thank you all. Thank you for our audience. I hope anyone who's at home and wasn't being able to join can join us in future events, and also can be able to access to our video online. We'll make sure it gets to many people. I would like to start a little bit with Farida, and this is something I wanted to say at the beginning. I think she covered amazingly, and the lack of, and it reflects on the lack of representation of the LGBTQI+ community in atrocity prevention and in laws, which are a very important element of prevention and also of culture change. And it shows this lack of representation, shows this pressing need to address this issue immediately. The LGBTQI+ community has been historically a marginalized group, and it has to be expressively included in prevention and also as a protected group in national, most likely in national laws, as international laws are always very difficult to change. So I would address that locally and have a connect different networks. I think you all of you referred to that, the importance of connecting networks from different regions and different countries in the world working for the same aim. A general inclusion of this community, of the LGBTQI+ community, would most likely exclude them from any definition, any sociological, and therefore legal definition of group. Going to Haley's and John's. Haley, thank you so much for your very interesting, more local presentation, but it gives us all in different areas of the world a very good view of what is happening in the US and maybe in some other parts of the Western world. And also makes us, and John's presentation, both of them makes us think of the importance of defining and regulating hate speech, and also to think of how to overcome the difficulties those regulations could have in countries with a broad protection of the right to free speech. Of course, I'm not attacking the right to free speech, but it is important to determine that there's a very thin line, and we need to address this in a proper way. I don't think hate speech is properly defined. There are many general definitions and many discussions about it, but I think this is something that we need to address in the future, and I hope we can work together on this. And also I wanted to highlight, and I think John mentioned it in particular, the importance, and maybe as a hope message, of working from the small nucleus of society, such as a family, I think you mentioned that, John, to the broader social communities or social forms of gathering, as well as networking, I reiterate, with different with different countries or groups locally. I want to put the example of Argentina. I'm from Argentina, and I'm very proud of the laws of Argentina. Argentina accepted equal marriage in 2009. It's one of the first countries in Latin America. And I want to put this as an example of how law can impact on the cultural identity of the country. There was not a broad acceptance in Argentina of equal marriage, yet after the passing of this important law, it started to become a more accepted institution in society. And this is what happens in many other aspects, such as the acceptance of legally acceptance of a non-binary identity in our identity cards, for example, inclusive language, etc. So I wanted to mention this as a special example of the impact of the law in a broader aspects of society. And ending with Lily's presentation, I would like to highlight also the importance of her historical perspective, the perspective she included with the Guatemalan Genocide, and how that relates to current laws, public policies, and politics regarding the LGBTQI community nationally and internationally. So thank you again. I think these are really important aspects. You have our institute as a hub. I can say the word, I don't know how to translate that, but as a hub for working with us and for connecting with other people. And we offer it to you, not only for this event, but also for the future. And I do hope we don't encounter any more hate speech, and we do welcome people who think differently to learn, to exchange in a very positive and constructive way. That's the only way we can make real change in society that is good for everybody. So thank you, and Gretchen, I'm available for translating when necessary. Thank you.
Alrighty. Thank you all for your presentations, and we will start asking a few prepared questions that we came up with. You may have touched on some of these questions in your presentations, so don't feel pressured to answer every question or summarize. So let's just get started. What do you think is the most pertinent threat or threats to the health and well-being to LGBTQ+ persons across the world right now? You can just jump in at any time.
I can go ahead and start with that one. I'm again, and I know this is sort of an international thing. So on some levels, I apologize for taking this sort of US approach, but I think in some ways, the United States and Western Europe are fairly aligned socially. And I think as goes the United States, as goes Western Europe. And what I'm seeing here is, I think to be a little bit more optimistic, I'll start with this. I think Latin America is doing a tremendous job in sort of resisting the right-wing hegemony that is forming in the Western Hemisphere, especially. The Colombia elected a leftist president for the first time in its history not that long ago. I think only a few days ago. And Uruguay is probably the most pro-trans nation on the planet, which is incredible, right? And so for the United States, and what I see is the biggest threat to that, right, to that trend, is two things. One is obviously the very obvious resurgent right, which many have discussed. but I'm going to perhaps be a little controversial here. I think the biggest threat right now is the way in which liberal women in the United States are putting their own safety, and not even talking about the issue of like preventing sexual assault. I'm talking about women who are sort of insulated from harm in the traditional sense. You know, they're not experiencing housing insecurity, they're not experiencing economic insecurity, they're very wealthy, they're very well off, they live in gated communities, and they're white, right? And a lot of these women who, for functionally outside of, you know, sex-based oppression on the idea of there being women, functionally don't have much to worry about in terms of oppression. And so what we're seeing is this weaponization of feminist rhetoric as a means of engaging in genocide, starting with rhetoric and stochastic violence before we get to that point, because the biggest point of concurrence between so-called radical feminists and trans-exclusionary radical feminists and the American right is this idea of protecting women. And we're sort of starting to see this sort of fall apart because a very right-wing activist named Christopher Rufo kind of spilled the tea on how he's using radical feminists to further his agenda. And the radical feminists are now up in arms about this, right? As if they weren't ideological allies from the beginning. And so what we're seeing is this huge trend of largely unoppressed people who are desiring some form of oppression because they need it, they crave it. And they're in turn flipping that oppression onto people who are the most vulnerable, right? The oppression of Germans by Jews in Nazi Germany was an invention, right? It was an invention to explain the economic insecurity faced by Germans in the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles in World War I, right? In this case, trans people are being blamed for everything such as high gas prices, wars, you know, the increase of in inflation. Everything absurd under the sun is somehow trans people's fault, just like everything under the sun was somehow Jewish people's fault in Nazi Germany, right? So the same principle is applying. And that, I think, in the West is translating elsewhere, because Putin has already been using this in Eastern Europe, right? But if the West goes, we have a big problem, because a huge chunk of the world that is controlling funding, military resources, and they will use those things to violently enforce these regimes around the world. And this is obviously most evident in colonial histories of Britain and other European nations.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have something they want to add, or should we move on to the next question? All right, we shall move on. This question has two parts, so I guess we'll just do it all in one. Have you seen greater internalization of homophobic and transphobic organizing in the past decade? And what about internalization of LGBTQ plus advocacy work?
I'm just hopping in. Internationalization of these things is the question, right? Is that right?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I read that completely incorrectly.
I just wanted to make sure to clarify. Okay, so yeah, yes, so ask again, please, Gretchen.
Sorry, have you seen greater internationalization of homophobic and transphobic organizing in the past decade? And what about that in advocacy work?
I can go ahead and say something.
I'm happy to jump in here.
Go ahead, Farida.
I think if we look specifically, can you guys hear me? Yeah, it's cutting off. I had a feeling. Ooh. Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Back, yay, okay. I think I'm going to maybe address the second half of that question. And if anyone wants to address the first half, I'll be more than happy to hear what you have to say. I think we have seen an internationalization of LGBTQI plus advocacy work, because the same way that we have seen, I think what I'm thinking of at the moment is that a lot of the queer rights organizations, and this is more in my personal capacity, but a lot of the queer rights organizations that I have either observed or worked with in the MENA region have really, I think, benefited from transnational advocacy and kind of different sorts of partnerships that, for example, international NGOs and local NGOs are able to get into when it comes to advocacy, because sometimes institutions that are working in the global north might have access to spaces that institutions in the global south do not have access to. And in opening these paths to collaboration, I think has been very helpful. And also, and this is something that had come up in my dissertation research, which was interestingly on transnational advocacy, is that also a lot of these advocacy spaces that bring people together from different parts of the world can be also very helpful spaces of learning and solidarity that goes both ways. That it's not only about global north institutions supporting global south institutions, but there is also, I think, a lot to learn from the resistance of civil society and civil society organizations and NGOs that are working in the global south for some of the movements that are also based in the global north. So I really hope that we get to see more internationalization of advocacy work, because we have so much to learn from one another. And we also have so much to offer each other, and it makes the collective movement stronger, I think. So that's where I'll stop, but yeah.
I can say something real quick about the first part of that question. And I think, yes, we have seen a tremendous internationalization of homophobic and transphobic organizing. And I think about that as happening in kind of two ways. The first is kind of the less intentional or less managed diffusion of these rhetorics, like Haley was talking about, via the internet and social media, where these debates that start in the US or the UK kind of trickle throughout the world and become hot button issues and provide hateful rhetoric for local movements to use that maybe kind of before the advent of the internet and the internationalization of these movements wouldn't have infected local movements in the same way. And then I also think you see the intentional organizing and coordination of homophobic and transphobic organizations internationally happens again on kind of two levels. Those who are specifically working against queer and trans people's rights and lives abroad. So examples of this include, coordination between the US Christian right and the Christian right in Uganda, for example, to create laws there. But then you also have more broadly these networks like those I talked about Steve Bannon trying to build that are not just about queer and trans issues, but are really about trying to implement this white Christian nationalist fascist agenda, basically wherever they find takers, right? They're not picky about where they're trying to implement these ideas. And I think it is really scary how well coordinated they are. And I think it's like John mentioned, they're finding these organizations outside of where, like outside of the United States in Steve Bannon's example, and providing money and access to those institutions that they have access to strengthen, hate groups and political extremist groups in other countries too. So there's a lot of levels we need to be worried about.
I would also...
go for it.
Oh, sorry. Just briefly to add, I mean, what we're doing right now, what we're doing today is internalization of queer advocacy, and a really important one, a really powerful one. But I think the issue that we all face when we try to go global or even try to network on a single continent or a single region is that we are firstly far worse funded than the anti-LGBTI movements, the anti-queer movements. And second of all, when we try to connect, it's an uphill battle rather than the other side is pushing downhill. So it's much more difficult for us. And again, I think all the international donors and supporters, because we are mostly civil society or academia, and we depend on donors and supporters, while these anti-queer groups fundraise in the millions, and it's much easier for them to organize in that way. So that's my take there.
I want to add just something very brief too. I mentioned this a little bit in my presentation, but I think an important distinction to make is, and that I didn't make in my presentation, is that woman, Jennifer Bielik. She is prominent. She is perhaps, if we had to speak of it like an actual organization, she is like head turf. She is like the #1 trans exclusionary radical feminist outside of maybe Posey Parker, who has literally gone on white supremacist podcasts and like defended her position, and which the hosts agreed with her. But I think the point that I'm making here is that Jennifer Bielik in particular is a member, an alumnus of Deep Green Resistance, which is a literal terrorist organization. They have stated explicitly previously goals to blow up industrial centers in the name of environmentalist causes. And also the group is explicitly transphobic and explicitly radical feminists. And they do this in the sort of in a weird amalgamation of eco-fascism and ecofeminism, right? I don't know if anybody's heard the term Strasserism before, or national Bolshevism, but it's kind of that mismatch of the worst parts of authoritarian ideology into this idea of feminism, right? And so I think again, just to sum it up, I think it's important to acknowledge that we have an alumnus of a terrorist organization that is spearheading this campaign, and it's not something that I think people are really highlighting, because Deep Green Resistance has not been really popular since, I want to say, like the 90s or 80s, right? And so that has sort of faded from collective cultural memory as society has moved away from the second wave feminist movement in the 60s and 70s, right? To today, but the legacy and advocates for Deep Green Resistance are still very much around. In fact, if you were to go online right now, you could actually see the Deep Green Resistance website. Still there, still stuff being published on it. And it's very telling the kinds of things they're choosing to focus on when they make these arguments against trans people, right? So I think that's something we need to be aware of when we're talking about anti-trans movements and anti-LGBTQ movements as they are spreading out internationally from the West.
All right, thank you very much. And moving on to our third question, what forms of education about LGBTQ+ issues can realistically be implemented to encourage people around the world to think in new and positive ways about the rights of LGBTQ+ people and their contributions to society?
I can not necessarily globally, because that's a big bite to take, and too broad of an issue that I think anyone can respond to. What we've seen that works in practice in this context of the Western Balkans region is to have some sort of meaningful representation in formal education, which is probably the hardest thing to achieve, because it's usually the system putting up a wall and saying, no, you can't have this. What we were able to achieve in Montenegro is to have all the negative anti-LGBTI content removed from secondary education textbooks. But then what happened is they didn't put any affirmative one in, they just left a void, and we're not in education anymore. The second part is, and this is where civil society comes in strongly, is this continuous public education, really just putting out same bits of information over and over again until they become widely accepted and understood, and having the system of diverse allies. I mean, it's not just civil society that's able to do this work, but we also have to have allies everywhere, fighting our fight and working alongside with us, because sometimes, a message about queer parenting will not resonate if it comes from a civil society organization, but will very much resonate if it comes from a prominent public figure that's connected to this issue. So I think these are the three things, again, that work in our context that may not necessarily work in others, but yeah.
All right, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add, or should we move on?
Just something quick for me. There's that Sartre quote about anti-Semites. You know, you can't like engage with them. And one of the things that I wish people would stop doing is play the game. You have to advocate in a way that completely ignores that kind of confrontation, because they don't believe in anything. They're not constrained by the rules of normalcy, civility, or civil rights. As you mentioned, John, it's an uphill battle and they're fighting a downhill one. And when you're going downhill, you have the luxury of different options, right? And you don't have to really change anything. Gravity can do all the work for you. But it is Sisyphean. It's we're constantly rolling up the ball up the hill. But I think not getting into debates with these people about what is a woman, you know, not getting into debates with these people about you know, the use of pronouns, because they're not actually interested in having a debate with you. They're interested in making you look stupid. And I think you have to play the game right back in terms of being ridiculous to them. Because that's the treatment they deserve. They don't deserve that kind of respect. And the minute you give it to them is the minute you lose, because they're not playing by any rules. And I think that's the biggest problem. So if we approach discourse on rights in a way that's offensive, meaning we go on the offense and not constantly play defense to whatever the right is saying about us, it becomes a much more affirmative case. And I think that's also part of the problem, right? You know, queer people, I think a big case is the miners' strike in London. So when Thatcher did her mining reforms, she the miners were pissed. They lost all their jobs. They lost all their wages. And LGBTQ people actually did a strike in support of the miners. And then when Pride Parade happened, the miners joined, you know, the activists. So bringing in other causes and showing the interconnectedness, I think, is another way in which you sort of connect LGBTQ liberation to the liberation of others. And I think once you can get people to insert themselves in this situation, it becomes far more easier to empathize with the struggle for LGBTQ equality. And I think that's part of the problem, is we talk about intersectionality, we talk about the ways in which oppression is systematic, but we don't actually do anything with it when it comes time to advocate. And I think by we, I just mean society, not individuals here on this panel. I want to make that clear. But yeah, I think that's kind of the biggest thing is we need to have actions and we need to go on the offensive. We can't just constantly play the rights game and educate in a way that makes sense to them. These people don't want to be educated. It's not our responsibility to educate them. We just have to advocate. And that's all we really can do besides other things.
Thank you so much. And this next question definitely touches on what you've said, being what are the best practices in advancing the rights of LGBTQ plus persons? And do you have any success stories to share? Should we move on to the next question, or? All right, we can move on. What are the most critical changes that we must make across our societies and within the LGBTQ plus rights movement to face the future threats to LGBTQ plus life effectively?
That's a difficult one. I think this may sound a bit harsh, but I think we have to get serious in the same sense that the other side or the anti-LGBT movement has gotten serious. They have structures in place, they have, you know, networks and everything, and we're still too loosely interconnected and too, I mean, I understand our starting points because we have to fight in our own communities, in our own countries for different issues and on different levels. While for them, it's more of a unified fight against us on whatever point they choose. But I think we have to get more serious. I think we have to get more united in that kind of structural, organized sense. We have to get more proactive, more assertive sometimes. Again, and this is speaking from just the context in which I'm working and living. So, but it's a very difficult also question or a difficult topic to respond to.
All right, thank you. Does anyone else have something to add, or should we move on?
I can jump in. I think if we're looking at facing future threats to LGBTQI plus life, oh, it went off again. Okay. So sorry, can you guys still hear me? Okay, great. I mean, this is very much coming from maybe, I think looking at the future, we really need to invest in early warning mechanisms and prevention, because it will keep happening over and over again unless we do something differently, and unless we start really paying attention to if we look at historical examples, what has already been shown to be a precursor to genocidal violence. And how can we make sure that this makes it into policy frameworks and is not there as a tick box exercise, but it's something that is actually taken on and that can have tangible impact on LGBTQ plus across the globe. So this is a very concise, simple answer, but I hope it made sense on your side. I'm sorry about the internet connection. It's atrocious.
I'll just add real briefly too that I think something that is so important about events like this is convincing those who are passionate about atrocity prevention that LGBTQ plus issues are part of that. Because I think my fear is, as natural disasters, violent conflict, global warming induced scarcity, all of these issues become more and more threatening in the coming decades, that LGBTQ plus issues are kind of the first thing to get tossed when people are worried about addressing other issues, right? You see it in a US context that the Democrats are saying, oh, there's all this partisanship and all these other issues we care about more. So we're not gonna risk conflict over LGBTQ plus issues in order to encourage working together on these other issues. And so I think doing as much as we can to convince people who are passionate about other causes that matter to us, but those people might not be passionate about LGBTQ plus issues, we need to convince them that this is not only something they should care about because people are worth caring about, but that it's actually very central to their agenda as well, and not this issue that can be cut whenever it's convenient for them because it doesn't really matter. I really, really appreciated the opening comments about how central this is to kind of all the issues of violence that we're concerned about.
All right, thank you so much. We will end the prepared questions there and open it up to audience members who have questions to ask. If you have a question to ask, you can either write it in the chat or you can use your little hand emoji and we can unmute you. All right, let me see. Elisa, are you able to unmute people? I hope
so. I hope so. Let me see. Okay.
I think if we press on ask to unmute next to people's pictures, they should be able to speak because I can see that button. I can try.
Okay, yeah, good, okay.
Oh.
So Leah, I am going to ask you to unmute. There we go.
Okay, fantastic. Thumbs up, can you hear me?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, well, first of all, I just want to thank you all so much for sharing your different perspectives and research and also your work. So my apologies to Ibrahim because this is going to be a bit of a lengthy, not just a comment, but also a question. So I'm really sorry about that, but please take that as a testament to how excellent the panel was. So I guess one thing I'd like to kind of zoom in on is the argument Haley was making about like the securitization of trans people and how that relates to genocide. Now, in my own research, I've definitely found examples of that. I think you cited that example of the parasitization of women's bodies, sort of things about like infiltrating corrupting spaces, sacrificing children to appease the trans lobby. There's lots of discourse that does feel like it's very similar to genocidal stuff. But there was a bit in one of your in your presentation that struck me as something that I thought, oh, okay, not sure if I agree with that. It was where you said, like the genocides above, it's abundantly clear that the purpose of this rhetoric against trans people is stochastic. It's to create the social conditions necessary where society views it as prima facie necessary to discriminate against transgender people. Now, if we look at like more sort of conventional genocide study stuff, like a lot of it is trying to draw in sort of the military or paramilitary security state. So the Holocaust is a defense against like Judeo-Bolshevism, Hutu power is a defense against RPF infiltration, Karadzic and co launching a terrible war defense against Bosniak demographic threat. And a lot of the prevention schema and prevention methods, and a lot of the stuff that like Farida was just talking about, seem to be geared towards addressing that and that kind of exterminatory direct categorical violence. And I guess one thing I'd quite like to not push back on, that sounds a bit like aggressive, but I'd just like to raise, and I think for all of the panelists have touched it in your own way, is how far do we see that in trans and LGBT plus issues? Because I think you cited some tweets which were examples of that, but I'm not necessarily sure how much that translates into the kind of policy and paramilitary and security frameworks we see in other genocides. And there were a couple of ones, like John talked about Hungary, and I think Lily's focus on sort of like LGBT issues weakening Western states and that they, them tank and stuff like that does seem to suggest like hints of that. But if we look at what, especially in the Anglosphere, like I'm from the UK, if we look at what the state does, it seems to be a different sort of attempt to like just eliminate trans people as a community. It's things like stochastic violence, denial of access to spaces, 5-year waiting lists to receive trans-affirming healthcare. And that seems to be a much more sort of social, indirect genocidal violence, which invites a different set of responses. And I guess I'd be interested in hearing from all of the panelists. How much do you see that kind of direct securitizing violence that brings together the discourse and the kind of self-defense aspect actually in policy, not just in individual activists? So that's part one of this epic question. Part two, I guess, is what kind of responses does a recognition that this is an incipient genocidal movement, what does this lead us to do? Because from what I've read and from what I've heard, it doesn't seem like we're looking at like, I don't know, the specific sort of protection frameworks like the UN Special Advisor puts forward, or like Strauss in Making a Nation puts forward. So yeah, A, is it this traditional genocidal threat, or is it something else? And B, what does the specific recognition of the threat invite us to do? Sorry, that was a small dissertation of a question, but I hope that speaks to some of your interests. And thank you.
If I can respond, I will concede that my my approach to the way in which I think about genocide against trans people, it kind of on some level departs from traditional notions of genocide, right? I look at symbolism and communication. So what is the purpose of this rhetoric? And I think, well, these are individual activists, and it's trickier because traditionally we think of genocide as a state enterprise, right? Some agents of the state or the state itself is invested in the wholesale elimination. And what I am looking at this is, at least in the UK, not necessarily any direct action by the state on behalf of these people, but what I'm looking at is they aren't exactly doing anything to silence these people either, you know, and so I'm looking at this as not so much genocide in a direct sense, but genocide by or stochasticism by not caring. You know, it's one of these things where I think, you know, there are more obvious examples. And I focused on rhetoric specifically, but to your point, it is a larger system, right? There are other things that go on. I think rhetoric is a big part of it. And I will concede as well that it does differ from the previous examples that I mentioned, in that a lot of those examples of rhetoric, you know, occurred while the genocide was ongoing, right? And so it's slightly different in that regard. But I think it's pretty safe to say that if you were to go and ask every trans exclusionary radical feminist head campaigner, or whether that's Sheila Jeffries, Mary Daly, if she were still alive, you know, all these people, I guarantee, I feel comfortable in saying this. I feel comfortable that if you went up to them and you said, if trans people were eliminated from the entirety of public life, would that make you happy? And I guarantee you a solid majority of them would say yes. And the reason that they say that is what leads it to me that even though these are individual activists, right, that systematically, if these people had the same power as the state, they would almost certainly use it to eliminate trans people from public life, and eliminate trans identity altogether. And they already advocate for things in that rhetoric that is implicitly and explicitly doing that, because trans people's identities are not tied up in the traditional notions of identity that we understand it. It's not like genetic, like race. And I hesitate to go that route because to me, if I start talking about the genetic identities of trans people, right, and trans being a gene, that just confirms the medicalization rhetoric that's used by these people, right? And I think they're not so much going after trans people themselves, but going after the very things that allow trans people to exist. And so they're not attacking trans identity directly, but by going after the things that enable trans people to exist in public life, they're creating social death, which I view as essentially the same principle as genocide. Right. And I hope that answers your question. I know it's not exactly perfect, but I think that, you know, there's clear eliminationist intention, whether that's implicit or explicit in these groups. And that's the reason I generally feel comfortable in making the comparison between the two groups and other genocides, right? Even though they don't necessarily have the same agency as the state does.
If I could add, everything Haley said was brilliant, absolutely. And I also think, speaking to a US context, the US military is, I mean, not completely left out of this, but in terms of committing genocidal violence against people in the US right now, not so much involved. But I think if you look at US police forces as serving a similar function, the level of violence, while maybe not reaching, you know, genocidal proportions, the level of violence that police forces inflict on queer and trans populations, particularly queer of color and trans people of color communities, is pre-genocidal proportions for sure, and has a lot of the same hallmarks of the way that police, military, and paramilitary forces are used in genocide. And I also think, you know, kind of like Haley mentioned, the government's letting these paramilitary groups, essentially, these militias that are carrying out violent attacks, planning violent attacks, they're letting them exist, they're letting them function, they're letting laws that make it easier for them to get guns be implemented. And so I think there is some of that paramilitarization that the government pretends to turn a blind eye to, but actually lets go on, which you see in a lot of genocides, right? Oh, well, we can't control them. You know, we're not supportive of them. What they do is what they do. I think that is happening. And I think in terms of a response, I don't have a good answer. But I do know that, and this goes, I think, for a number of genocidal threats, not just those to LGBTQ plus lives, that we can't assume the traditional mechanisms of prevention, which are built on the same legacies of settler colonialism and white supremacy that have put us in this position, are going to get us out of this position as well, especially when a lot of those documents, thinking about the Genocide Convention, were written and constructed and influenced by the countries that we're now talking about as perpetrators of genocide, and were purposefully written in a way to protect the US, to protect Russia from past charges of genocide, and I think are continuing to function in that way today too. So I think we need to look outside of some of those traditional channels.
Okay, do we have time for Ibrahim's question, Elisa?
Yes, let's take Ibrahim's question. We have 1 minute, but we can go a little bit over if our panelists are okay with that. Okay, fabulous. Thank you guys so much. Yes, Ibrahim, I'm going to ask you to unmute. There we go. Oh, did it work? Ibrahim,
hello, can you hear me?
Okay, perfect, yes.
Yeah, so I had a couple questions, but I'll just only ask one of them. And the particular question was, since the Western Balkans was mentioned this time, I'm wondering if it's possible if someone could comment on the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, since I recently watched a couple educational videos about the Republika Srpska and how that whole entire situation is deteriorating. So I'm just wondering, since you've already seen people mention about how, say, the Democrats in the US are kind of dropping the ball on LGBTQ issues to get more headway in other issues, if you can expect a similar kind of situation going on in Bosnia as like Republika Srpska becomes more separatist, would you expect that any kind of LGBTQ issues would become thrown under the bus and to get more unity?
I can jump in, and by no means am I an expert on politics in the Western Balkans. I just happen to live here. Thank you for this question. I mean, situation in Bosnia is a very complex one, politically and societally, and in every context. I mean, just the way that the whole country is set up, having a federal republic and a traditional republic and an independent entity. A lot in the Western Balkans depends on the pressures coming from the Western powers, if you will, or the European Union, the United States, and the Western allies. Will LGBTI rights suffer if it comes to any form of separation or division? Of course, they are suffering right now, but there is a very strong and very resilient pushback from activists in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As we're speaking, the Pride in Sarajevo is taking place. So, and that's something that wasn't imaginable in Bosnia and Herzegovina some years ago. So I think as long as the West is in agreement as to how to proceed in the Western Balkans and in Bosnia specifically, we won't see what has happened in the 90s or any form of I hope, anything going in that direction. But again, that's outside of politics in Bosnia itself. It's more of a issue for the Western allies and Bosnia and the Bosnian people. But it's a very complex question. I mean, we can spend a couple of weeks just discussing this, but thank you for that. And again, LGBTI rights in Bosnia have moved forward in the last years, and we hope to see them move even more forward and catch up with some other countries.
Farida, do you have anything to say about, have you guys done work in Bosnia Herzegovina around this issue?
I think specifically not my program at the moment, but I do know that it is an avenue that we do want to work on as we develop the next phase of this work. But I don't think I'm well positioned to answer this question. But.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Well, I think we have gone for 2 hours now, and I think we're going to have to draw this roundtable to a close. But I want to say, in concluding this roundtable, that this was incredible. And I cannot thank our panelists enough for their presentations. They were brilliant, really informative. I'm sorry that we had to close our audience so early. So it was rather small, but for those of you who are now watching on the video or whatever, the recorded version, we had a problem with trolls. I don't know if that'll come through in the recorded version. And so we had to close the comments and we had to close actually the participants. And that just is indicative of what we're facing, I think. I loved John's note that, and I want to, have a disclaimer like him, that we have to get serious. Of course, people have been serious, but I think organizing transnationally, organizing internationally, as Farida said, putting this on the prevention agenda, which her organization is working so hard to do, is incredibly important in fighting this now really globalized and as you all said, sort of internationalized movement against certain groups of people. I think it would make a huge difference if we were to argue, for example, or state that trans exclusionary radical feminism is a genocidal ideology. I believe, and I don't say that for political reasons, I say it for forensic reasons, for all of the reasons that both Lily and Haley Marie articulated so well. We're really facing movements and ideologies that seek the destruction of LGBTQ+, particularly trans life, whether it's through, and I loved Leah's question, whether it's through, sort of more society-based efforts to sort of prevent the emergence of identities or the expression of identities, or it's through much more state-based traditional direct violence and action. Genocide, of course, can express itself in a combination of patterns and techniques. And often it's that combination that proves to be the most devastating. So in addition to direct killing or concentration of populations, you have all of these other indirect measures that serve in the end to make the expression of a certain identity, and particularly its reproduction, its forceful historic reproduction as agent into the future impossible. So I think that we're onto something here. I'm very excited about this conversation. I would love to bring you all back in 4 months or so, maybe half a year, to talk about what's going on now in the world. And in the meantime, I hope we will all work together to continue this internationalization effort. And certainly to bring on new people and new voices. So Ibrahim and Leah, if you would like to join us, please be in touch with all of us. We want to continue the discussions with you. And then finally, I want to thank so much Gretchen Moore and Lexi Poston for all of your work on this and supporting this work and for supporting the Lemkin Institute. You guys did a fabulous, fabulous job. You were brilliant. Thank you so much. And thanks to our audience too. Thank you all. Okay. So everybody stay safe, be well until the next time. Thanks everybody.
Bye.
Bye everybody. Thank you for having me.
So much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.